I'm Jorge Ramos.
And I'm Paula Ramos.
And this is The Moment. Hola, déjame contarte una historia. Just a few weeks after Donald Trump was elected, I went to a conference in Cartagena, Colombia. There were a lot of experts on democracy and the important process of participating in the society. But then everybody went to one expert, this thought leader, on what she thought about democracy in America. Is there a threat to democracy? And what's going to happen with Donald Trump?
So you're talking about Anne Applebaum. Anne is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, writer, author. You may have read her on The Atlantic. Her latest book is Autocracy, Inc. But more than anything, Anne is an expert on democracies and authoritarianism. I think this is a moment, Dad, where we can agree that everyone is asking this one question, right? Like, is the United States headed towards authoritarianism? Are we there? Are we not? Anne is someone that can help you understand the elements, the environment, and the signs to help us measure whether or not we're losing our democracy.
And what I find so interesting is that she can talk about the dark side of history, but also about hopefulness nowadays in the United States and the rest of the world. And Applebaum, when we come back.
Well, and thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to The Moment.
Thanks for having me.
So before the end of the year, we wanted to come to you to really take this as an opportunity to look at the past, to help us reflect on everything that this country has endured over the last year. And I think I don't have to tell you, I think a lot of people feel overwhelmed by the news, by the noise, and I think your voice, your commentary, your writing on The Atlantic, of course, your latest book, Autocracy, Inc., I think all of that has really anchored thousands of people, including myself. And I think you've allowed for a lot of people to situate the current American moment within a historical context. And so thank you again. Today, I want to start by just looking at the last couple of days. You see an administration that has once again completely transformed the immigration system, suddenly pausing immigration from 19 countries. You see an administration that continues to dismantle the Department of Education, someone that just pardoned the former president of Honduras, who, of course, is a convicted drug trafficker. And all of this is happening as the United States weighs a potential invasion in Venezuela. And so it's a lot. But my question for you is, when you look at this administration's behavior, do you see chaos or do you see an actual plan?
So I think you can answer that by saying that there's more than one actual plan. There are several people who have plans, and they sometimes contradict, and that this is why it might look like chaos. But I think what you're actually seeing is just competition between different ideas. So on the one hand, it's clear that you have a part of the administration that wants to use immigration not even as a real policy issue, but as a part of the culture wars. So they're using a crackdown on immigrants, on people who look, to some Americans, look foreign or look different, as a way of demonstrating their power and showing their supporters, look, we're cracking down on this diversity that you don't like, and we're deporting people. And some of the deliberate cruelty is part of that too. You know, they're trying to appeal to something very ugly that I don't think is in all Americans, but there's some percentage who support it. You know, simultaneously, you have some people who are part of this administration because they are interested in money. And many of the pardons, the people who've been pardoned in the last year, and I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head, but Trump has pardoned many, many times more people in 1 year than I think any previous president had ever pardoned in 4 years. And so some of that is about responding to donors and other supporters, maybe people who've invested in Trump's cryptocurrency company. The pardon system seems to have been set up to reflect different people's, not just the president, but people around the president, their interests, maybe their financial interests or their political interests. And so you have these kind of, you know, as I said, seemingly different noisy things happening at the same time. And actually the story in Venezuela, which maybe we should have a step back and have a more nuanced discussion of it, also seems to me to be about several things at once. It's part of the idea that we are I don't know if we're going to invade, but we're using force against Venezuela to stop narco-terrorism is something that's clearly part of this domestic culture war that's useful for the administration domestically. Maybe there are also oil interests there. There's maybe a small part of the State Department still cares about helping Venezuelans and helping them have a better government and maybe allowing their democratically elected leaders to rule the country rather than an illegitimate government. But you're not hearing those people. I mean, if that's what anybody thinks, they aren't saying so right now. So all of these policies are the product of different groups. I mean, maybe one group or one philosophy will win out in the end, but right now we see several in competition.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time I saw you, I think it was in Cartagena, Colombia, and the world seemed very different. It was the beginning of 2025, and Trump had just begun his second term as president. And I remember that you were very concerned about the threats to American democracy posed by Trump. I think you've been asked 100 times the same question. It's exactly the same question. La democracia americana está en peligro. And obviously you gave all your answers, but I wonder if you have been taken by surprise by the speed and by the extent of the changes that we've seen.
So honestly, I'm not surprised. The language that Trump was using during the campaign was unlike the language that any other American presidential candidate had ever used. Talking about immigrants and also other Americans as vermin, as poison, as garbage. This isn't this even in the during the era of the civil rights when we had segregationists running for office in the United States, George Wallace, people like that. They weren't using that kind of language. In fact, they went out of their way to be very polite. I don't know what they thought, but they spoke about separate but equal, or they had other justifications. And this is the first American politician who's used that kind of language. And to me, it sounds like the language of the worst dictators of the past. I mean, and I know because I've written books about them. And so it has always bothered me. And the second thing that bothered me about Trump was that I knew that the people around him in his second term would be very different from the people in his first term. He's surrounded by people who were attracted to him after January the 6th. In other words, they saw what happened on January the 6th, and they said, we like that. We like the idea of overthrowing American democracy. All of them are people who think fundamentally that something about the system needs to be overthrown. So in that sense, they aren't conservatives in the old definition of the word conservative. They aren't interested in preserving what's good from the past. They aren't interested in building on the experience of history and moving forward. These are people who are radicals, and they were interested in radical change. They were interested in making very dramatic shifts that would be visible, that would be comprehensible to some of their radical supporters. And I think they're also very interested in changing things in a way that is irreversible. The destruction of U.S. aid, for example, they did it in such a way that it can't be rebuilt. I mean, and even if it's ever found to be illegal, which I think it was, I mean, the U.S. administration didn't have the right to destroy an institution that was created by Congress. Congress and our system being the body that decides about funding. Nevertheless, it's too late because it's gone, and all the people and contracts and organizations that worked with it have been cut. And so I think the speed is a reflection of that radicalism. And I think you could hear the radicalism over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So even the language, I mean, they keep on using, I remember just a few years ago, nobody called undocumented immigrants illegal immigrants, illegal aliens. And now it's been used over and over again, and it has been normalized completely. It's just the language that is changing so much.
And they're very conscious of this language. They use it in a way that's designed to create maximal polarization, to create the idea that there's a group of, and, they don't only just talk about immigrants being illegal, they talk about them being criminals. We're arresting criminals. Yeah. And so the idea is that, you focus your anger and and distrust and dislike of whatever it is that you don't like about American life, focus it on these illegal criminals who are seeking to undermine our country, or change its nature, and focus your anger on them. And we're going to show you how we'll arrest them, and we'll do so in the most brutal way possible. And we'll film ourselves doing it, and then we'll make video clips out of it. I mean, that's the kind of politics that we're seeing. And again, it's just, for me, I've lived mostly in Europe over the last 30 years, and I wrote books about the Soviet system before that. And these are not new ideas. These are familiar ideas. And again, it doesn't mean that America is already a dictatorship or anything like that. We still have lots of freedoms. We still have the ability to use our institutions. We can vote. And so I don't want to give people this feeling of hopelessness. All I'm saying is that they are using authoritarian tactics that have been tried in other places. They know what they're doing. They're using propaganda of a kind that's familiar. It's not coming from nowhere. And that should be a warning light to everybody.
We have to take our first break, but we will be right back. We continue our conversation with Anne Applebaum. Paola.
And so it sounds like you're not necessarily surprised at the extent and the way in which this administration is governing, but I'm wondering if you're surprised around the language that he's using at the global stage, right? Because there's something about the way in which Trump talks to authoritarian figures that I'd love for you to help me understand, right? I'm thinking of the way that he talks to Xi of China, Putin of Russia, obviously Orban in Hungary, even Kim Jong-un in North Korea, even the way that he supported Milei, Bolsonaro, Bukele in El Salvador. What type of impact does the sort of American president's deference to these authoritarian figures have in the international stage? And was that even surprising for you?
So again, this is something he did do in his first term, and actually it's something he's been doing all of his life. So Trump instinctively admires people who don't have to live with any kind of controls or checks and balances. And I don't think this is so much of a political instinct as a personal one. He admires people with absolute power. When he speaks of the Chinese dictator, he speaks of him with admiration. Look at all these millions of people who have to do what he says. I think he looks at someone like Orban, who was democratically elected within a democracy and who broke a lot of rules in order to stay in power indefinitely. He looks at him as someone, who really achieved something because of that. So he admires authoritarians instinctively, I think, and he admires people who break rules and get away with it instinctively. So this is connected to his personality, and it's not so much of a political philosophy. These are things he was born with, and he's attracted around himself other people who feel the same way. And this wasn't normal in any American administration before. Certainly for the last 100 years, the people who've been in power in the United States haven't openly admired dictatorship, or if they did, they kept it somewhere in the back of their head and they didn't reveal it. It wasn't the language of American democracy or of American political leadership. And so you are right to pinpoint this as one of the most dramatic shifts.
And it's a shift that continues to decrease our credibility in the international community, I assume.
Well, it decreases our ability to have allies. So all of our old allies everywhere feel suspicious of us and will be hesitant to work with us. Over time, it will decrease our ability to do things or to achieve things that we want, because we won't find that people cooperate with us. Certainly, there were a lot of countries in the world who cooperated with the United States on the basis of an assumption of shared values. Okay, we're all democracies. We'll work with you because we think that what you're trying to do, even if we don't like some specific aspects of your policy, we think you're promoting democracy. I think that's going to end pretty quickly. Maybe some future president could revive it, but right now Trump is really doing a lot of damage to those traditions. And at the same time, he is also therefore doing damage to the system of laws and rules and norms that have they haven't ruled the world since 1945. I mean, that's an unfair thing to say,
Right.
but I mean, the language of the UN Charter, for example, speaks about how it's wrong for one nation to invade another, to change borders by force. And there was an assumption that big nations didn't just get to dominate small nations automatically, that, there was something wrong with that. And Trump is undermining and reversing that language, and that will make it easier for future Russian invasions of Ukraine. It could make it easier for Xi to invade Taiwan. I mean, once the taboo is gone, and I recognize in some cases it was only a taboo; it was violated in practice. But once that's gone, then why shouldn't big countries try to occupy smaller ones? Why won't we have a return to imperialism and to, great power conflicts of a kind that we knew in the past? And I don't know whether Trump understands this or not. I think probably not, although again, I suspect some people around him do. But what he's doing is damaging a whole system of alliances and rules and international law and multilateral institutions that will be pretty hard to ever put back together again.
And let me jump into Venezuela. You just mentioned that a few moments ago. In your book, Autocracy, Inc., you write extensively about the warm relationship between authoritarian regimes and how economic interests keep them together. But so let me concentrate on Venezuela. You describe the warm relationship between Venezuela and Turkey, also the ties between Iran and Venezuela and how the gold and oil is flowing freely. But is there anything that Turkey and Iran can do now to prevent the military conflict between the U.S. and Venezuela? In other words, has Trump changed absolutely everything, including these relationships?
No, I mean, actually, the more important relationships for Venezuela right now are China, which has big investments there, Russia, which has armed Venezuela in the past, and of course, Cuba, which supplies security advice to the Venezuelan regime, and I'm told actual security guards to Maduro personally.
The bodyguards, yeah.
To Maduro personally. I don't have an insight into what's happening there right now, but I would be surprised if some of those forces aren't being activated. One of the reasons Maduro has not relinquished power already, one of the reasons why, despite having lost a legitimate election and having facing an opposition that proved he lost. Remember, this is the Venezuelan opposition showed the tally papers from the polling booths showing that they had won the election and Maduro had lost. One of the things that had given Maduro the confidence to stay in power anyway was his sense of foreign support, were his allies in the authoritarian world. Whether those allies will risk everything to come to his aid, if the U.S. uses military force against Venezuela, I don't know. I mean, Russia is in a bad position right now. It wasn't able to help its ally in Syria because they're losing so many men and so much equipment fighting in Ukraine. Iran has also suffered recently. Maybe the United States will be facing a Maduro who's weaker, for those reasons. But I mean, certainly his allies haven't abandoned him. I mean, you can't count out the possibility that they're there and that they're helping him survive now, and that they'll help him survive some kind of U.S. military pressure.
Just a quick anecdote. I remember interviewing Nicolás Maduro a few years ago in Palacio de Miraflores, and he didn't like the interview. And at the end, we were arrested and deported from Venezuela just for asking questions. But something interesting, and what happened is I came in with a couple of Cuban-American producers, and they were telling me, hey, Jorge, todos los guardaespaldas son cubanos. All the bodyguards are Cubans. And that was so surprising. Even the New York Times just recently wrote an article about that. So going back to Venezuela, nobody obviously knows exactly what's going to happen. But is there a likely scenario for you? And why is the U.S. doing that? Just to create maximum pressure? Or really there's going to be a surgical operation trying just to get Maduro out of Venezuela the same way they did with Noriega in Panama?
So I don't know. I've heard that there are several scenarios still being considered. And actually, I heard a month ago that they were very close to choosing one of them, and they hadn't chosen it yet. So, I can't tell you exactly what the scenario is. The confusing question for me is, why exactly are we doing this? I am the first to agree that the Venezuelan regime is illegitimate, that it's dependent on the international narcotics trade. It's a bad actor in the region. It's produced, more refugees, even in a country without war, than Ukraine and Gaza combined. It's an illegitimate regime, and I will not be sorry if it goes. What worries me, though, is the Trump administration's motives and what kind of example they're going to set by doing this kind of operation. One is, I fear that some of the motives are domestic, to portray the president as a wartime president who's fighting brown-skinned narco-terrorists, which will then allow him to somehow amp up that same so-called war inside the United States. I'm worried that there are people in the administration who think that by doing this, they'll get special access to oil reserves in Venezuela, or else that there are companies around the Trump administration who think they will get that, and that's another primary motivation. And then third thing that worries me is, when China watches this, or Russia, but let's talk about China for the moment. What they see is a kind of dress rehearsal for what the invasion of Taiwan could look like. Troops on the boats around the island, putting pressure, creating some false reason for invasion. This is exactly what the Chinese will do if they invade Taiwan. And so I fear that the United States is offering a very ugly example for the world, and particularly for the autocratic world, of how to repress a neighbor.
We have to take another break, and we'll be right back. We continue our conversation with Anne Applebaum. Paola.
I was just saying that I spent some time, a lot of time, with Trump supporters. I'm talking to you from New York City, but for a story I've been working on. And just yesterday, I was having a conversation with Trump supporters in Brooklyn, and many of them are very upset about these alleged invasions and sort of this administration, in their words, betraying their America First philosophy. And so that's just one thing I keep thinking about. But I wanted to talk to you about the parallels that you've long seen and have been studying, right? I'm thinking about all the years that you spent researching the Soviet archives, which of course led to your monumental book, Gulag: A History, which of course discusses the repressive Soviet system, giving you and earning you a Pulitzer Prize in 2004. But I remember one of the things that you said is how when you were researching, you assumed that you were writing about a distant past, that you assumed that you were writing about a type of repression and state violence that in some ways wouldn't come back. And so I'm curious, looking back and understanding where you are now as a historian, what has that felt like for you personally to sort of see this distant past come back to the present? And was there specific moments that really gave you pause?
So there is a very specific moment. So when the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014, I watched that invasion it was extraordinary, because I had just finished writing a book about the Soviet invasion of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, Hungary and Poland and East Germany. And I watched it with a kind of historian's eye, oh, look, they're doing exactly what they did in 1945.
Yeah.
They brought out the old playbook. And I saw how they were working with criminal groups in Crimea to take over the peninsula. And I thought, I missed that. I should have looked into criminal organizations, and were they cooperating with criminal organizations after the Second World War? Because I bet that was a bigger part of the story than I wrote in my book. So I saw that as really almost an exact, they were doing the exact same thing. And I have to say, since then, the nature of the Russian occupation of Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, but also the newer territories, looks identical to the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe in 1945, 1950. And it also looks a lot like the Sovietization of Ukraine in the 1930s. So this is there's a system to it. You arrest the chief of police and the mayor and the teachers, and you eliminate the symbols of the old system. And in this case, they force people to stop speaking Ukrainian. They don't teach Ukrainian history anymore. They kind of eliminate the top edge of society. They terrorize everybody else. And this is not an echo of the past. I mean, this is literally the same system. And to see that come back in such a graphic way is very shocking. And then, of course, for me, the secondary shock is seeing an American president. He's not able to do those things in the United States, but seeing him almost admire Putin for his brutality. Almost, imply sometimes that, look, the Russians have fought so hard they deserve to keep this territory, ignoring what's happened on that territory. You think of American presidents in the past who fought against fought the Nazis, fought against the Soviet regime, understood the nature of those regimes and why they were bad and why they were dangerous, even for Americans, why that system was so dangerous. And then you see an American president who doesn't seem particularly bothered by it. Right. And it makes me, it makes me wonder whether, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, it has echoes. And and this is a very strange version of an echo.
Right before doing this interview, and I was listening to the NATO Secretary General, who seems to be a Trump fan all the time, and he says that only Trump can bring peace to Ukraine. And as we record this interview, there are conversations underway in order to try to end the fighting in Ukraine. But you've expressed skepticism about a possible peace deal. So is peace possible in Ukraine unless Ukraine cedes part of its territory to Russia?
Peace will only happen in Ukraine, real peace, lasting peace that isn't just a ceasefire, when the Russians understand that they can't win. In other words, that they understand that they cannot conquer all of Ukraine and that Ukraine will not become part of a new Russian empire. And as far as I can see, the Russians haven't come to that conclusion yet. They aren't acting like a country that knows it won't win the war. Even though they aren't winning the war, I should say, for some of this territory, they've been fighting in the Donbass since, for 11 years now, and they still haven't managed to conquer it. But they've been encouraged by the Trump administration to believe that they still have a chance, that they might be able to win. And what disturbs me the most about these negotiations is that they are, at the moment, encouraging Putin to keep fighting. I think. Maybe it's possible to achieve some kind of, temporary ceasefire or halt of, end of conflict for a while. But the real test is, can the war end in a way that Ukraine is a sovereign country, that it's able to protect itself against a future invasion, and that it's, and that the Russians understand that Ukraine will have protection and has friends and has allies and won't be a country they can conquer again sometime in the future. And that's all much more important than where is the border. Maybe Ukraine would give up some territory. I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's politically possible for the president of Ukraine to give away territory that the Russians haven't conquered.
For Zelensky to do that,
He can't do it. I mean, he won't be allowed to do it. I mean, the army won't do it. Ukrainian army doesn't work like that. It's a very decentralized army, and it will not take an order to retreat, I don't think. Not from territory where they aren't under pressure. But I can imagine other kinds of negotiations being possible. But that isn't the main. That's not the main problem. The main problem isn't the borders of Ukraine. The main problem is, have the Russians given up their goal of conquering the country? And I just don't think that's happened yet. And so, I want there to be negotiations. I want people to keep talking. But I just have a lot of doubt right now about whether the language that Americans are using in Moscow is the right kind of language, whether remember that this team is there not only negotiating about Ukraine, but also negotiating future American-Russian business deals. Also something, by the way, that was unimaginable in any previous administration. So I question, how are they speaking to the Russians? What kind of ideas are they giving to the Russians? What kind of ideas are the Russians giving to them? Because their purpose should be to say, it's time to end the war and Ukraine is going to be independent. And the Russians need to accept those things, and then we can talk. And I'm just not hearing that yet.
Sticking for one more second, just on this idea of parallels, obviously we spent a lot of time in this podcast talking about immigration and a lot of the issues that are affecting Latinos and immigrants in this country. And so I'm curious, when you look at the images of, masked ICE agents and the images of them racially profiling people, using this violent language, separating families, driving around in unmarked cars, is it fair to say that it almost reads like a chapter in Gulag? Like, is that a fair comparison? Do you see those parallels at all?
I don't want to compare it directly to the Soviet Union, but I would certainly say that these are authoritarian tactics. So the creation of a paramilitary, in other words, a militarized national police force, like an interior ministry police, you would call it in an old-fashioned, pre-89 East European country, giving those people unclear kinds of power. I mean, they seem able to break the law or twist the law with impunity. I mean, they've arrested, by the way, several dozens of Americans, people with American passports and American citizenship. And so far, they don't seem to be paying a price for that. They don't seem to be apologizing, or they seem to be getting away with it. And that is it's not full-blown Stalinism, but it's certainly the use of paramilitaries is on the road in that direction. And so it is an authoritarian tactic. You can see it in other countries where the system is, the democratic system is falling apart. Actually, it was one of the things Chavez brought to Venezuela, was the use of paramilitaries. So not just the real military, but also this kind of other forces, who had somehow weapons, and they were able to repress people. And for the moment, it's legitimized in the eyes of some Americans by the fact that it's being directed supposedly at foreigners. But I fear that it's not just U.S. citizens being arrested, it's also the way in which the presence of military on the street will change American behavior and thinking. I mean, you've heard several U.S. governors worry that the use of ICE and or maybe even the National Guard during midterm elections could intimidate some people from voting. I think it's illegal to have armed people near polling stations, but you could imagine them on the streets. So there are ways in which this use of armed men, masked armed men, which is also, by the way out of U.S. tradition. I mean, our policemen have name tags, and our military have name tags.
Right.
Masked men in unmarked cars, acting with apparently outside of the law. This is something that's changing the relationship of Americans to the state in all kinds of ways that I think will only become clear over time. And yes, I think it's certainly it certainly comes directly from an authoritarian playbook.
And what's interesting too, just wanted to say very quickly, Dad, is that the polling doesn't really seem to be serving him when it comes specifically to immigration, and yet they're not stopping, right? And yet it seems like this force keeps growing and keeps becoming more and more violent. The streets are more militarized. Do you see that growing? I mean, do you see a next iteration of this sort of beginning paramilitary force in the U.S.?
Well, the next iteration is that it grows larger, it becomes omnipresent, and as I said, it begins to shape how people feel about going out of the house. I mean, all people, not just immigrants, or people of Latin American background. I mean, it's the idea is to create a symbolic force that's designed to discourage people from participating in public life. If it continues to metastasize, you'll see more reaction. I mean, there is a pushback. There's a pushback coming from the courts. There are protests. There are people filming and taping what's going on, which I think helps. So it's not like we're on some inevitable march towards dictatorship. I mean, I think U.S. citizens have a lot of agency. They have a lot of ability to stop this, to protest it, to make ICE accountable. But it's clear to me, again, that I said this at the beginning, there is a part of this administration that is there because they don't like American democracy and they want it changed. And this is one of the tools they're using. And that is exactly why, as you point out, they don't care about the opinion polls.
And we just have a few more minutes with you, but I wanted to ask you about this. More than a decade ago, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Crimea, you wrote many articles against it. But then Russia-based websites started attacking you personally, even before the term fake news became popular. So my question is maybe a little more personal. Has this taken a toll on you? And how do you protect yourselves nowadays against authoritarian regimes that hate what you write about them?
So when this first started, when I first became aware of, slanderous things being written about me, I'm taking money from mysterious organizations, whatever. There were all kinds of things. When it first happened, and this is more than 10 years ago, I was very upset. I remember talking to lawyers and what should I do? I mean, it is an awful thing to say, but of course, over time, you get used to it. You learn to ignore it. You realize that what happens in the online world doesn't necessarily matter in the offline world, and you develop this very, very thick skin. I think one of the changes that has affected, almost everybody in public life, not just journalists, university presidents and people who run companies and people who run NGOs. Everybody who has any kind of public profile now understands that part of the price of being in public is that you can be subject at any moment to doxing, to a smear campaign, and so on. And the only way to survive it is just to move on and somehow let it pass. And so something kind of clicked in my head, and I'm not really bothered by it. Maybe I should be, but I'm not. And that
we need to learn from
I can't,
her dad.
To the extent that I can.
We're learning. Yeah.
We're all learning, and you just move on, and you understand that you also have friends and sympathizers and people who like you, and you stick with them, and you stay away from the people who make death threats. That's the best I can say. It's also, I think, very hard now to distinguish performative threats and violence and insults from real things that matter. And so much of what happens online is performance. People actually make money out of running smear campaigns or out of using extremist language. You get more clicks, you get advertising dollars on YouTube or on X. And once you understand that that's actually what's going on and it's not really about you personally, it becomes somehow easier to just live with it.
That's funny because I've done a lot of stories with Proud Boys and insurrectionists and Moms for Liberty, and it's interesting who they are online is so different from who they are in person, and that's always my first impression every time I've finally seen them face to face, including someone like Enrique Tarrio. That's the first thing I noticed. Just there's almost this insecurity, this small personality that really hides behind their online persona. So I
remember they're
really
making money out of those online personas.
Exactly.
That's their career. And the more extreme they become, the farther. We've created this. This is a longer conversation, but we've created an information system that rewards extremism, and that, to me, that's actually the real source of the problem.
Just very quickly, and we spend so much time talking about authoritarians, autocrats, monarchs, strong men, but I've always wondered what you think about what they say about Americans themselves, right? This idea that we were once again capable of electing someone like Donald Trump. Like, what have you learned about Americans?
Look, the authoritarians always thought that America was hypocritical. In other words, that we would say these things about democracy and so on, but we didn't really believe it. And I would say that the events of the last, decade or so show that that was partly true, that there were some Americans who said things they didn't believe, and then it turned out there were some Americans who didn't really believe in democracy either. But I would like to reserve the idea that there are a lot of people in this country who are deeply distressed by what's happened, including some former Trump voters, and who understand and still identify with the deeper values that this country was founded to project and to protect. And I think that those people will, as they begin to understand what they could lose, that we will mobilize, and we will eventually react.
A final question, Paula. and Paola had a question about her grandfather and Cuba, and I just don't want to leave this interview before allowing her to do that.
Well, no, and I think I'm glad that you took us there, and to maybe end on a more positive note. I did want to ask you about Cuba because I was in Miami when Fidel Castro died, right? And so my grandfather was a political prisoner. I come from my mom's side they're all Cuban exiles, and so I grew up, with this idea that one day, the idea was that my grandfather would one day go back to Cuba. And I remember what you wrote in 2016, and I'm quoting you. This is right after Fidel Castro dies, and you say, and I'm quoting, you say, "Soon, I hope that Cubans will be given the freedom to understand their past, to commemorate their dead, to begin to undo the damage wrought by decades of silence." My grandfather passed away 2 years ago, so he was never able to go back. And so do you see any hope in a place like Cuba?
There's always hope. Everything always changes. There's always a new generation. There are always people who can pick up old ideas from the past, and that we've seen it happen with bad ideas, but also there are good ideas. There are always people with new experiences who will reflect on them and act in different ways. And I should say there's another thing. There is a set of human instincts. I wouldn't say so much about democracy, but about justice. People know when they're living in an unjust system, in an unfair system. And there will always be people who want to make it better, fairer, more equal, more acceptable to more people.
Mm-hmm. And that gives you hope, I assume.
You see it over and over and over again in history, and I hear it. I travel to a lot of places, and I meet a lot of people from really awful countries, or places where there's really, there's a lot of violence and repression, and even among those, exile communities or diasporas, I still find people who still believe in the possibility of change, and they're right because things do change. The Soviet Union did collapse, and Poland did become a democracy, and the system continually changes, and the human instinct for justice never goes away.
And thank you so much. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
The Moment is a production of Radio Ambulante Studios in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura Podcast Network. Our staff includes Daniel Alarcón, Laura Rojas Aponte, and Lisa Cerda, with help from Paola Leán, Diego Corso, Natalia Ramirez, and Elsa Liliana Ulloa. The CEO of Radio Ambulante Studios is Carolina Guerrero. Executive producers at iHeart are Arlene Santana and Leo Gomez. Pablo Cabrera, Dylan Unger, and Mark Canton also serve as producers. Sound design, final mix, and theme song by Elias Gonzalez. Our hosts are Jorge Ramos and Paola Ramos. If you like this episode, please share the word. Recommend The Moment to anyone who might enjoy unpacking these complicated times with us. If you like The Moment, pero también te gustan los podcasts en español, check out Radio Ambulante Studios. Our shows, Radio Ambulante, El Hilo, and Central, are really worth a listen. I'm Miguel Santiago Colón. Thanks for listening.